Master by Angela Carter. After he discovered that his vocation was to kill animals, the pursuit of it took him far away from temperate weather, until in time the insatiable suns of Africa eroded the pupils of his eyes, bleached his hair, and tanned his skin until he no longer looked the thing he had been, but its systematic negative. He became the white hunter, victim of an exile which is the imitation of death, a willed bereavement. He would emit a ravished gasp when he saw the final spasm of his prey. He did not kill for money, but for love. He had first exercised a propensity for savagery in the acrid lavatories of a minor English public school, where he used to press the heads of the new boys into the ceramic bowl and then pull the flush upon them to drown their gurgling protests. After puberty, he turned his indefinable but exacerbated rage upon the pale, flinching bodies of young women, whose flesh he lacerated with teeth, fingernails, and sometimes his leather belt, in the beds of cheap hotels near London's great rail termini. King's Cross, Victoria, Euston, etc. But these pastel-colored excesses, all the cool, rainy country of his birth could afford him, never satisfied him. His ferocity would attain the coloring of the fauves only when he took it to the torrid zones and there refined it until it could be distinguished from that of the beasts he slaughtered only by the element of self-consciousness it retained. For if little of him now pertained to the human, the eyes of his self still watched him, so that he was able to applaud his own depredations. Although he decimated herds of giraffe and gazelle as they grazed in the savannas, until they learned to snuff their annihilation upon the wind as he approached, and dispatched heraldically plated hippopotami as they lolled up to their armpits in ooze, his rifle's particular argument lay with the silken indifference of the great cats. And finally, he developed a speciality in the extermination of the printed beasts, leopards and lynxes, who carry ideograms of death in the clotted language pressed in brown ink upon their pelts by the fingertips of mute gods who do not acknowledge any divinity in humanity. When he had sufficiently ravaged the cats of Africa, a country older by far than we are, yet to whose innocence he always felt superior, he decided to explore the nether regions of the New World, intending to kill the painted beast, the jaguar, and so arrived in the middle of a metaphor for desolation, the place where time runs back on itself, the moist, abandoned cleft of the world, whose fructifying river is herself a savage woman, the Amazon. A green, irrevocable silence closed upon him in that serene kingdom of giant vegetables. Dismayed, he clung to the bottle as if it were a teat. He traveled by jeep through an invariable terrain of architectonic vegetation where no wind lifted the fronds of palms, as ponderous as if they had been sculpted out of viridian gravity at the beginning of time and then abandoned, whose trunks were so heavy they did not seem to rise into the air, but instead drew the oppressive sky down upon the forest like a coverlid of burnished metal. These tree trunks bore an outcrop of plants, orchids, poisonous iridescent blossoms, and creepers the thickness of an arm with flowering mouths that stuck out viscous tongues to trap the flies that nourished them. Bright birds of unknown shapes infrequently darted past him, and sometimes monkeys, chattering like the third form, leaped from branch to branch that did not move beneath them, but no motion nor sound did more than ripple the surface of the profound, inhuman introspection of the place, so that here to kill became the only means that remained to him, to confirm he himself was still alive. For he was not prone to introspection and had never found any consolation in nature. Slaughter was his only proclivity and his unique skill. He came upon the Indians who lived among the lugubrious trees. They represented such a diversity of ethnic types, they were like a living museum of man, organized on a principle of regression. For the further inland he went, the more primitive they became, as if to demonstrate that evolution could be inverted. Some of the brown men had no other habitation than the sky, and like the flowers ate insects. They would paint their bodies with the juice of leaves and berries and ornament their heads with diadems of feathers or the claws of eagles, placid and decorative. The men and women would come softly twittering around his jeep, a mild curiosity illuminating the inward turning, amber suns of their eyes, and he did not recognize that they were men, although they distilled demented alcohol in the stills of their own devising, and he drank it, in order to people the inside of his head with the familiar frenzy among so much that was strange. His half-breed guide would often take one of the brown girls who guilelessly offered him her bare-pointed breasts and her veiled limpid smile, and then and there infect her with the clap to which he was a chronic martyr in the bushes at the rim of the clearing. Afterwards, licking his chops with remembered appetite, he would say to the hunter, "Brown meat, brown meat." In drunkenness one night, troubled by the prickings of a carnality that often visited him at the end of his day's work, the hunter bartered for the spare tire of his jeep a pubescent girl as virgin as the forest that had borne her. She wore a vestigial slip of red cotton, twisted between her thighs, and her long, sinuous back was upholstered in cut velvet, for it was whorled and ridged with the tribal markings incised on her when her menses began, raised designs like the contour map of an unknown place. The women of her tribe dipped their hairs in liquid mud and then wound their locks into long curls around sticks and let them dry in the sun until each one possessed a hairdo of rigid ringlets, the consistency of baked unglazed pottery. So she looked as if her head was surrounded by one of those spiked halos allotted to famous sinners in Sunday school picture books. Her eyes held the gentleness and the despair of those about to be dispossessed. She had the immovable smile of a cat, which is forced by physiology to smile, whether it wants to or not. The beliefs of her tribe had taught her to regard herself as a sentient abstraction, an intermediary between the ghosts and the fauna, so she looked at her purchaser's fever-shaking skeletal person with scarcely curiosity, for he was to her no more, yet no less surprising than any other gaunt manifestation of the forest. If she did not perceive him as a man, that was because her cosmogony admitted no essential difference between herself and the beasts and the spirits. It was so sophisticated. Her tribe never killed. They only ate roots. He taught her to eat the meat he roasted over his campfire, and at first she did not like it much, but dutifully consumed it as though he were ordering her to partake of a sacrament, for when she saw how casually he killed the jaguar, she soon realized he was death itself. Then she began to look at him with wonder, for she recognized immediately how death had glorified itself to become the principle of his life. But when he looked at her, he only saw a piece of curious flesh he had not paid much for. He thrust his virility into her surprise, and once her wound had healed, used her to share his sleeping bag and carry his pelts. He told her name would be Friday, which was the day he bought her. He taught her to say master, and then let her know that was to be his name. Her eyelids fluttered, for though she could move her lips and tongue, and so reproduce the sounds he made, she did not understand them. And daily, he slaughtered the jaguar. He sent away the guide, for now he had bought the girl. He did not need him. So the ambiguous couple went on together, while the girl's father made sandals from the rubber tire to shoe his family's feet, and they walked a little way into the 20th century in them, but not far. Among her tribe circulated the following picturesque folk tale. The jaguar invited the anteater to a juggling contest in which they would use their eyes to play with, so they drew their eyes out of their sockets. When they had finished, the anteater threw his eyes up into the air, and back they fell, plop, in place in his head. But when the jaguar imitated him, his eyes caught in the topmost branches of a tree, and he could not reach them, so he became blind. Then the anteater asked the macaw to make new eyes out of water for the jaguar, and with these eyes the jaguar found that it could see in the dark. So all turned out well for the jaguar, and she too, the girl who did not know her own name, could see in the dark. As they moved always more deeply into the forest, away from the little settlements, nightly he extorted his pleasure from her flesh, and she would gaze over her shoulder at shapes of phantoms in the thickly susurrating undergrowth, phantoms, it seemed to her, of beasts he had slaughtered that day, for she had been born into the clan of the jaguar, and when his leather belt cut her shoulder, the magic water of which her eyes were made would piteously leak. He could not reconcile himself to the rainforest which oppressed and devastated him. He began to shake with malaria. He killed continually, stripped the pelts, and left the corpses behind him for the vultures and the flies. Then they came to a place where there were no more roads. His heart leaped with ecstatic fear and longing when he saw how nothing but beasts inhabited the interior. He wanted to destroy them all, so that he could feel less lonely. And in order to penetrate this absence with his annihilating presence, he left the jeep behind at a forgotten township where a green track ended and an ancient whiskey priest sat all day in the ruins of a forsaken church, brewing firewater from wild bananas and keening the stations of the cross. Master loaded his brown mistress with his guns and the sleeping bag and the gourds filled with liquid fever. They left a wake of corpses behind them for the plants and the vultures to eat. At night, after she lit the fire, he would first abuse her with the butt of his rifle about the shoulders, and after that with his sex, then drink from a gourd and sleep. When she had wiped the tears from her face with the back of her hand, she was herself again. And after they had been together a few weeks, she seized the opportunity of solitude to examine his guns, the instruments of his passion, and perhaps learn a little of Master's magic. She squinted her eye to peer down the long barrel. She caressed the metal trigger, and pointing the barrel carefully away from her as she had seen Master do, she softly squeezed it in imitation of his gestures to see if she, too, could provoke the same shattering exhalation. But to her disappointment, she provoked nothing. She clicked her tongue against her teeth in irritation. Exploring further, however, she discovered the secret of the safety catch. Ghosts came out of the jungle and sat at her feet, cocking their heads on one side to watch her. She greeted them with a friendly wave of her hand. The fire began to fail, but she could see clearly through the sights of the rifle, since her eyes were made of water. And raising it to her shoulder, as she had seen Master do, she took aim at the disk of moon, stuck to the sky, beyond the ceiling of boughs above her. For she wanted to shoot the moon down, since it was a bird in her scheme of things, and since he had taught her to eat meat, now she thought she must be Death's apprentice. He woke from sleep in a paroxysm of fear and saw her, dimly illuminated by the dying fire, naked but for the rag that covered her sex, with the rifle in her hand. It seemed to him her clay-covered head was about to turn into a nest of birds of prey. She laughed delightedly at the corpse of the sleeping bird her bullet had knocked from the tree. and the moonlight glimmered on her curiously pointed teeth. She believed the bird she shot down had been the moon, and now in the night she saw only the ghost of the moon. Though they were lost, hopelessly lost, in the trackless forest, she knew quite well where she was. She was always at home in the ghost town. Next day, he oversaw the beginnings of her career as a markswoman and watched her tumble down from the boughs of the forest, representatives of all the furred and feathered beings it contained. She always gave the same delighted laugh to see them fall, for she had never thought it would be so easy to populate her fireside with fresh ghosts. But she could not bring herself to kill the jaguar, since the jaguar was the emblem of her clan. With forceful gestures of her head and hands, she refused. But after she learned to shoot, soon she became a better hunter than he, although there was no method to her killing, and they went banging away together indiscriminately through the dim green undergrowth. The descent of the banana spirit in the gourd marked the passage of time, and they left a gross trail of carnage behind them. The spectacle of her massacres moved him, and he mounted her in a frenzy, forcing apart her genital lips so roughly the crimson skin on the inside bruised and festered, while the bites on her throat and shoulders oozed diseased pearls of pus that brought the blowflies buzzing about her in a cloud. Her screams were a universal language. Even the monkeys understood she suffered when Master took his pleasure. Yet he did not. As she grew more like him, so she began to resent him. While he slept, she flexed her fingers in the darkness that concealed nothing from her, and without surprise, she discovered her fingernails were growing long, curved, hard, and sharp. Now she could tear his back when he inflicted himself upon her, and leave red runnels in his skin. Yelping with delight, he only used her the more severely, and twisting her head with its pottery appendages this way and that way. In pained perplexity, she gouged the empty air with her claws. They came to a spring of water, and she plunged into it in order to wash herself, but she sprang out again immediately because the touch of the water aroused such an unpleasant sensation on her pelt. When she impatiently tossed her head to shake away the water drops, her clay ringlets melted all together and trickled down her back. She could no longer tolerate cooked meat, but must tear it raw between her fingers off the bone before Master saw. She could no longer twist her scarlet tongue around the two syllables of his name, Masta. When she tried to speak, only a diffuse and rumbling purr shivered the muscles of her throat, and she dug neat holes in the earth to bury her excrement. She had become so fastidious since she had grown whiskers. Madness and fever consumed him. When he killed the jaguar, he abandoned them in the forest with the stippled pelts still on them. To possess the clod, she was in itself a kind of slaughter. And tracking behind her, his eyes dazed with strangeness and liquor, he would watch the way the intermittent dentillation of the sun through the leaves muddled the ridged tribal markings down her back, until it seemed the blotched areas of pigmentation were subtly mimicking the beasts who mimic the patterns of the sun through the leaves. And if she had not walked upright on two legs, he would have shot her. As it was, he thrust her down into the undergrowth amongst the orchids and drove his other weapon into her soft, moist hole, while he tore her throat with his teeth, and she wept, until one day she found she was not able to cry any more. The day the liquor ended, he was alone with fever. He reeled, screaming and shaking. In the clearing where she had abandoned his sleeping bag, she crouched among the linneas and crooned in a voice like soft thunder. Though it was daylight, the ghosts of innumerable jaguar crowded round to see what she would do. Their invisible nostrils twitched with the prescience of blood. The shoulder to which she raised the rifle now had the texture of plush. His prey had shot the hunter, but now she could no longer hold the gun. Her brown and amber-dappled sides rippled like water as she trotted across the clearing to worry the clothing of the corpse with her teeth. But soon she grew bored and bounded away. Then only the flies crawling on his body were alive, and he was far from home.